The morning sun streamed through the large windows of Atlanta International Airport as passengers for Flight 237 to Washington, D.C., lined up at Gate C-22. Among them stood Lieutenant General Thomas Wilson, a tall man with graying hair at his temples, and the straight-backed posture that came from 30 years of military service. He wore civilian clothes, a navy blazer over a light blue button-down shirt and khaki pants, but something in his bearing still marked him as a soldier. Wilson checked his watch. He was returning to the Pentagon after a 5-day visit with his grandchildren. His daughter had just had her third child, and he had taken rare personal time to help out and meet the newest addition to their family. Now duty called him back. Now boarding Flight 237 to Washington, D.C., starting with our military personnel and families, announced the gate agent. Wilson nodded politely to the agent as he handed over his boarding pass. Though he qualified for the early boarding, he never flaunted his rank in civilian settings. The respect shown to him as a 3-star general was something he believed should be earned through character, not demanded through position. "Thank you for your service, sir," the gate agent said, noticing the military ID he used alongside his driver's license. "Thank you for your support," Wilson replied with the warm smile that had earned him the nickname Gentle Giant among his troops. He made his way down the jet bridge, his carry-on rolling quietly behind him. On board, he found his seat in the 5th row, aisle seat as he preferred, and settled in, placing his bag in the overhead compartment before sitting down. The plane gradually filled with the usual mix of business travelers, families, and solo passengers. Wilson pulled out a book, a biography of Frederick Douglass he'd been meaning to read for months, and began to lose himself in the pages as the cabin hummed with pre-flight activity. In row 8, Officer James Reed boarded the plane. He wasn't in uniform, but rather wore jeans and a polo shirt that strained slightly against his barrel chest. His department-issued firearm was holstered beneath a light jacket, a violation of airline policy that he'd managed to slip past security. By flashing his badge and mentioning he was on official business, in truth, Reed was simply traveling to visit his brother. But he never went anywhere unarmed. The badge and gun were extensions of his identity, shields against a world he viewed with suspicion. Reed took his seat, immediately reclining it as far as it would go and spreading his arms across both armrests, much to the discomfort of the middle-aged woman seated beside him. When she politely asked if he might share the armrest, he gave her a look that made her withdraw the request and turn toward the window. The final passengers boarded, the doors closed, and the flight attendants began their safety demonstration. Wilson, who had flown countless times, still gave them his full attention, a courtesy born of the same respect he showed to anyone doing their job with professionalism. As the plane taxied and eventually took off, the cabin settled into the gentle rhythm of cruising altitude. About 30 minutes into the flight, the attendants began their beverage service. Wilson had dozed off, his book resting in his lap. He woke to the sound of the cart stopping at his row. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" asked the flight attendant, a woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Patricia. "Water would be fine, thank you," Wilson replied. "And if it's not too much trouble, might I get a blanket? The air conditioning is quite strong." "Of course, sir. I'll bring one right away after I finish the beverage service," Patricia responded, with a smile. From a few rows back, Reed watched this exchange with narrowing eyes. He'd been nursing a lingering resentment since being passed over for promotion last month, a decision his captain had attributed to interpersonal skills needing improvement. The real reason, Reed believed, was the department's new diversity push, which he viewed as threatening his position. When Patricia passed his row with the beverage cart, Reed stopped her. "I need a blanket too," he said, his tone demanding rather than requesting. "Certainly, sir. I'll bring blankets after completing the drink service," Patricia replied professionally. "Why does that guy up there get special treatment?" Reed asked, loudly, gesturing toward Wilson. "I saw you promising to bring him one right away." Patricia kept her customer service smile in place. "I'll be bringing blankets to everyone who requests them after I complete this service, sir. What would you like to drink?" Reed took a soda but continued to simmer. His mood wasn't helped by the 2 miniature whiskey bottles he'd emptied into the drink when Patricia wasn't looking. another violation of his department's off-duty conduct policies. 20 minutes later, as Patricia distributed blankets, Wilson thanked her warmly. Reed, watching, made a loud scoffing sound. "Some people think they deserve special treatment," he said, just loud enough to carry. Wilson didn't react, assuming the comment wasn't directed at him. He unfolded his blanket and returned to his book, but Reed wasn't finished. The whiskey had loosened what few filters he normally employed. When Patricia handed him his blanket, he said, "I had to wait just as long as everyone else, even though I protect and serve this country every day. Not like some people who just sit in offices and give orders." A few passengers glanced uncomfortably in Reed's direction. Patricia, sensing potential trouble, moved on quickly to complete her task. Wilson continued reading, oblivious to the building tension behind him. An hour into the flight, he got up to use the restroom, excusing himself politely to the passengers beside him. As he stood in the aisle waiting for the lavatory to become available, Reed decided to get up as well. The timing placed them both in the narrow aisle, with Wilson standing near the lavatory door and Reed a few steps behind. When another passenger exited the lavatory, Wilson moved to enter it. "Hey," Reed called out, his voice carrying through the cabin. "There's a line here, buddy." Wilson turned, surprised. "I apologize. I didn't realize you were waiting. Please, go ahead." This polite response seemed to irritate Reed further. "Yeah, you just thought you could cut in front of everyone else, didn't you?" Passengers nearby began to look up from their books and screens. Wilson, confused by the hostility but determined to diffuse it, spoke calmly. "There seems to be a misunderstanding. I'm happy to wait my turn." "I bet you are now that you've been called out," Reed said, taking a step closer. His voice had taken on an edge that several passengers recognized as trouble. A young woman in a nearby seat quietly began recording with her phone. Wilson assessed the situation with the rapid clarity of someone who had managed conflict zones. The man confronting him was agitated, possibly intoxicated, and looking for an altercation. The best approach was de-escalation. "Sir, I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot. I'm Lieutenant General Wilson. I apologize if I've somehow offended you." The mention of Wilson's rank had the opposite effect of what he'd intended. Reed's face flushed dark red. "Oh, a general, huh? Think that makes you better than the rest of us? I'm law enforcement, buddy. I deal with real threats every day, not pushing papers in some cushy office." Patricia appeared at the end of the aisle, alerted by the rising voices. "Gentlemen, is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Wilson said calmly. "I believe this." Gentleman was next for the restroom. Reed ignored the opening to end the confrontation. Instead, his voice grew louder, and he began using language that made several nearby passengers flinch, words loaded with racial undertones that left no doubt about what had triggered his hostility. Wilson's expression remained neutral, though a muscle tightened in his jaw. In 3 decades of service, including combat deployments and international diplomacy, he had encountered such prejudice before. He knew better than to respond in kind. "Sir," Wilson said, his voice quiet, but carrying the natural authority that had helped him rise through the ranks. "I understand you're upset. I suggest we both return to our seats and enjoy the remainder of the flight." "Don't tell me what to do," Reed spat back. "You people always think you can give orders to everyone." By now, half the cabin was watching. Several more phones were recording. Patricia had been joined by the head flight attendant, a veteran crew member named Robert, who had handled his share of difficult passengers. "Sir," Robert addressed Reed, "I need you to return to your seat immediately." Reed turned his glare to Robert. "Do you know who I am? I'm a police officer." He reached into his jacket and pulled out his badge, flashing it with a dramatic gesture that caused several passengers to gasp. Not because of the badge, but because the movement had revealed the gun holstered beneath his jacket. The sight of the weapon changed the atmosphere in the cabin instantly. A mother pulled her child closer to her. An elderly man reached for the call button. Wilson, seeing the situation deteriorating rapidly, made a decision born from years of crisis management. "Officer," he said, using Reed's claimed profession as a sign of respect, "we're all just trying to get to our destination safely. Why don't you use the restroom first, and then we can all go back to our seats? But Reed was past the point of reasonable conversation. The combination of alcohol, personal frustration, and the public setting had created a perfect storm of poor judgment. He pointed a finger at Wilson's chest. You think I don't see what's happening in this country? People like you getting promotions and special treatment while people like me get pushed aside? I've had enough of it. Robert spoke into his crew phone, alerting the cockpit to the situation. Within moments, the captain's voice came over the intercom. This is your captain speaking. All passengers, please return to your seats immediately and fasten your seatbelts. Crew, prepare for possible turbulence. The turbulence was a code, and the crew knew it. They began moving efficiently, securing carts and checking that the path to the exits was clear. Standard procedure for an in-flight incident. As the tension in the narrow aisle reached its breaking point, passengers held their breath, wondering what would happen next between the agitated officer and the composed general. The tension in the narrow airplane aisle hung thick as fog. Passengers watched with wide eyes and held breath as Officer Reed stood facing Lieutenant General Wilson. His finger still pointed accusingly. Some were recording with phones while others looked ready to duck behind seats if needed. Sir, this is your final warning, Robert, the head flight attendant, said to Reed. Return to your seat now or we'll have authorities waiting when we land. Reed turned his anger toward Robert. I am the authorities, he said, his words slightly slurred. I'm handling a situation here. Wilson remained perfectly still, hands visible at his sides, making no sudden movements. His years of training in hostile territories had taught him that unexpected motion could trigger dangerous reactions from agitated people. His eyes surveyed the cabin quickly, noting the elderly couple 2 rows back, the young mother with a sleeping toddler, the businessman, who looked ready to intervene. Each represented a potential casualty if this situation wasn't diffused properly. Officer Reed, Wilson said, his voice calm and steady. I think we both want the same thing here, a peaceful flight. Why don't we discuss whatever's bothering you after we land? I'd be happy to listen. The use of his name, which he hadn't provided, seemed to surprise Reed momentarily. He'd forgotten his badge was visible, but rather than calming him, it fueled his paranoia. You checking up on me? Reed demanded. That how it works now? You people keeping tabs on real Americans doing real work? A woman gasped at Reed's choice of words. Someone whispered, Is he serious right now? Another passenger was on the phone, with the airline's customer service describing the situation in hushed, urgent tones. Patricia stepped closer to Robert and whispered something. He nodded and began moving backward toward the front of the plane, presumably to update the cockpit on the escalating situation. Reed noticed the movement and misinterpreted it. Nobody's going anywhere until we sort this out, he announced loudly. Then, in a moment that would later be replayed on news channels across the country, Reed reached inside his jacket and partially drew his weapon. He didn't point it at anyone, didn't even fully remove it from its holster. But the mere sight of a gun on an airplane transformed the tense atmosphere into silent terror. A child began to cry somewhere in the back. The young mother pulled her toddler closer to her chest, turning to shield the child with her body. Wilson didn't flinch. He'd faced loaded weapons before in circumstances far more dire than this. Instead, he utilized the commanding presence that had guided troops through combat zones. Officer Reed, he said, his voice pitched to carry authority without aggression. I am Lieutenant General Thomas Wilson of the United States Army. I need you to secure that weapon immediately. It was the voice that had ordered troops into battle and brought them home again, that had negotiated with foreign military leaders and commanded respect in the Pentagon's corridors of power. Several passengers visibly relaxed at the sound of it. Someone was taking control of the situation. Reed blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by the direct identification. His hand remained on his partially exposed weapon, but he didn't draw it further. Lieutenant General? Reed repeated, disbelief evident in his tone. That's correct, Wilson confirmed. 30 years of service, currently stationed at the Pentagon. And I'm respectfully asking you, as one servant of this country to secure your weapon and return to your seat. This isn't the place for whatever grievance you're carrying. For a brief moment it seemed as though Wilson's approach might work. Reed's hand hesitated. His eyes, bloodshot from the alcohol he'd consumed, darted around the cabin, perhaps finally, registering the terrified faces surrounding him. But the moment passed. Reed's expression hardened again. "Show me your ID," he demanded. "Anyone can claim to be a general." Wilson nodded slowly. "I'm going to reach for my wallet. It's in my back right pocket." He narrated his movements before making them, just as he would in approaching a checkpoint in a conflict zone. "I'm moving my right hand now very slowly." With deliberate care, Wilson retrieved his wallet and extracted his military ID. He held it up where Reed could see it clearly. Reed squinted at it, then scoffed. "That could be fake." From a nearby seat, an older gentleman spoke up. "It's not fake. That's Lieutenant General Wilson. I served under him in Operation Desert Shield. He's the real deal, son." The unexpected support came from a gray-haired man wearing a Veterans of Foreign Wars cap. He was looking at Reed with the kind of disappointment that only comes from one who has seen real battle judging someone misusing the authority of uniform. Reed glanced at the veteran, then back at Wilson. Something in his expression shifted, not toward reconciliation but toward deeper resentment. "So everyone's on your side, huh? The whole system's rigged." "There are no sides here," Wilson said. "We're all Americans on this plane, all just trying to get home safely." From the cockpit, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to the situation on board, we're being diverted to Charlotte Douglas International Airport. We'll be landing in approximately 20 minutes. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." The announcement seemed to snap Reed back to reality, at least partially. His hand moved away from his weapon, though his posture remained confrontational. "You did this," he accused Wilson. "You're going to cost me my job." Wilson shook his head. "No one wants that outcome, Officer Reed. There's still a way to resolve this professionally. Secure your weapon, return to your seat, and we can all move. Forward." Robert had returned and was now standing a safe distance behind Wilson. "Sir," he addressed Reed, "the captain has requested that everyone be seated immediately. The aircraft is beginning its descent." Reed looked from Wilson to Robert, then to the concerned faces around him. For the first time, doubt flickered across his features. He seemed to be calculating his options and finding them increasingly limited. "Fine," he muttered finally. "But this isn't over." He adjusted his jacket to conceal his weapon again and turned to head back to his seat. Passengers visibly exhaled as he moved past their rows. Wilson remained standing until Reed was seated, then nodded to Robert. "Thank you, sir," Robert said, quietly. "Would you mind remaining in the front gallery with the crew during landing? The captain would like to speak with you, and it might be safer." Wilson glanced back at Reed, who was now staring out the window, jaw clenched. "I think that's wise," he agreed. As Wilson followed Robert to the front of the plane, passengers reached out to touch his arm or whisper thanks. A middle-aged woman pressed a business card into his hand and murmured, "I'm an attorney. Call me if you need a witness statement." The veteran who had spoken up gave him a respectful nod. A flight attendant offered him water, which he accepted gratefully. In the cockpit, the captain was on the radio with air traffic control, arranging their emergency landing. The first officer turned briefly to acknowledge Wilson's presence. "Airport. Security and police will board as soon as we land," he informed Wilson. "Is the passenger armed?" "Yes," Wilson confirmed. "Handgun, right side holster." He identified himself as a police officer, but he's showing signs of intoxication and emotional instability. The captain, still managing their descent, nodded grimly. "We've relayed that information. They'll be prepared." He paused, then added, "Thank you for your handling of the situation, General. It could have gone much worse." Wilson shook his head. "I'm just sorry it happened at all." Through the cockpit window, the Charlotte skyline was coming into view. The plane banked slightly as it lined up with the runway, and Wilson steadied himself against the wall. He was thinking about the man in row 8, not with anger, but with the analytical mind that had solved complex problems throughout his career. What had brought Officer Reed to this point? What system had failed to identify and address his issues before they erupted 30,000 feet in the air? As a leader, Wilson had always believed that individual failures often pointed to organizational weaknesses. This incident felt like a symptom of something larger, something broken in the systems meant to select and train those entrusted with authority. The landing gear deployed with a mechanical thud that vibrated through the aircraft. On the ground, below, emergency lights were already visible. Police cars and airport security vehicles positioned near the runway. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing," the captain announced over the intercom. Wilson felt the weight of the moment. When those doors opened, Officer Reed would face consequences that would likely end his career and possibly result in criminal charges. The other passengers would have their travel disrupted, their sense of safety shaken. And Wilson himself would be drawn into an investigation and perhaps media attention that he neither wanted nor sought. Yet as the plane descended toward the runway, Wilson's mind was already organizing next steps. Ensure passenger safety during deplaning, provide a clear statement to authorities, follow up to make sure the incident was properly addressed rather than buried. It was the same methodical approach that had guided him through 3 decades of military service. Assess, plan, execute, evaluate. The aircraft touched down smoothly despite the tense circumstances, a testament to the pilot's professionalism. As they taxied toward a remote area of the airport rather than a regular gate, Wilson caught sight of the law enforcement response, at least 6 vehicles with lights flashing. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came over the speakers one more time. "We have landed safely at Charlotte Douglas International Airport. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened until further instructions. Local authorities will be boarding the aircraft momentarily." In the main cabin, passengers were quiet, many still processing what they had witnessed. Some were already sharing videos they'd recorded, while others comforted children or each other. Near the back, a flight attendant was keeping a watchful eye on Officer Reed, who sat rigidly in his seat staring straight ahead, his future unraveling with each passing second. Wilson took a deep breath. The immediate crisis had passed, but he knew from experience that what followed would be equally challenging. Untangling the how and why, addressing the systemic issues, ensuring accountability while allowing for redemption. It was the harder, longer work that came after the adrenaline faded, the work that would determine whether this incident became merely another headline or an opportunity for meaningful change. The aircraft came to a complete stop. Outside, law enforcement officers were approaching. The next chapter of this unexpected confrontation was about to begin. The plane sat on the tarmac of Charlotte Douglas International Airport, surrounded by flashing lights from police vehicles, airport security, and emergency response units. Inside, the passengers remained seated as instructed, though many were filming or texting updates to concerned family members. The cabin hummed with tense whispers. Lieutenant General Wilson stood in the galley near the cockpit, speaking quietly, with the captain and first officer. They decided Wilson should remain out of sight when authorities boarded, to avoid triggering any further reaction from Officer Reed. "They're opening the door now," the first officer said, glancing out the small window. The main cabin door opened with a hydraulic hiss. 2 airport police officers entered first, followed by 4 Charlotte police officers in tactical gear. They moved with practiced efficiency, having been briefed on the situation during the plane's descent. The lead officer, a woman with short, gray hair and the composed demeanor of someone who had handled countless crises, addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Captain Brennan with Charlotte Airport Police. We're responding to a report of a disturbance and possession of an unauthorized firearm on this aircraft. Please remain seated while we handle this situation." Her officers had already identified Reed from the description provided by the flight crew. 2 of them moved directly to his row, while others positioned themselves strategically throughout the cabin. "Sir," one officer addressed Reed, "I need you to stand slowly and place your hands where I can see them." Reed didn't move immediately. He sat rigidly in his seat, eyes forward, jaw working as if chewing through options that were rapidly disappearing. "Sir," the officer repeated, his hand now resting on his holstered weapon, "I won't ask again." Around them, passengers held their breath. The young mother with the toddler was quietly singing a lullaby, trying to keep her child calm. The elderly couple held hands tightly. The businessman who had seemed ready to intervene earlier was recording everything on his phone. Finally, Reed stood. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, his voice steadier than it had been during the confrontation. "I'm a police officer. I'm authorized to carry." "Not on a commercial aircraft, you're not," Captain Brennan said, having moved down the aisle to join her officers. "Please place your hands behind your head and interlace your fingers." Reed complied, though his face flushed dark with humiliation and anger. "You're making a mistake," he insisted. "Ask that so-called general. He's the one who caused all this." "We'll sort everything out at the station," Captain Brennan assured him, professionally neutral. "Right now, we need to secure that weapon and get you off the aircraft." As the officers carefully removed Reed's firearm and placed him in handcuffs, Captain Brennan addressed the other passengers. "Folks, we'll need statements from everyone who witnessed the incident. In the meantime, the airline is arranging alternate transportation for you to your destinations. We appreciate your patience and cooperation." Wilson, watching from the galley, noted the captain's effective command presence. She'd taken control of the situation without escalation, maintaining both authority and calm, exactly how such incidents should be handled. As Reed was escorted toward the exit, he suddenly twisted to look back toward the front of the plane, finally spotting Wilson. "There he is," Reed called out. "Hiding up front while I get arrested. This is what happens when they put people like him in charge." The officers tightened their grip and hurried Reed through the door before he could say more, but his words had left a palpable discomfort in the cabin. Several passengers looked toward Wilson, who met their gazes steadily. Once Reed was off the aircraft, Captain Brennan approached Wilson. "Lieutenant General Wilson? I'm Captain Brennan. I'd like to speak with you about what happened, if you don't mind." Wilson nodded. "Of course, Captain, and thank you for your team's professional response. Just doing our job, sir. If you'd come with me, we can take your statement somewhere more private." As Wilson followed her toward the exit, passengers began to applaud. It started with the veteran in the VFW cap and spread quickly, a spontaneous expression of gratitude and respect. Wilson acknowledged it with a humble nod, uncomfortable being cast as a hero for simply doing what he felt anyone should have done in the same situation. The airport had prepared a small conference room for processing the incident. Wilson was escorted there while other officers began taking statements from the flight crew and passengers. The airline had already announced they were arranging hotel accommodations for everyone and rebooking them on morning flights. In the conference room, Wilson sat across from Captain Brennan and a detective from the Charlotte Police Department. "From what we understand," Brennan began, "Officer Reed became hostile toward you without provocation, made racist comments, and eventually displayed his weapon. Is that accurate?" Wilson chose his words carefully. Officer Reed appeared agitated from early in the flight. His hostility seemed to escalate after I identified myself as a military officer. He did make several comments that I would characterize as inappropriate and prejudiced. And yes, he partially drew his weapon during our interaction near the lavatory. The detective was taking notes. "Did he point the weapon at you or anyone else?" "No," Wilson clarified. "He partially removed it from his holster in what I interpreted as a threatening gesture, but he didn't aim it." "And you believe alcohol was involved?" "He displayed signs consistent with intoxication, slurred speech, impaired judgment, heightened emotional responses." Captain Brennan nodded. "We'll be conducting a blood alcohol test. We've already contacted his department in Atlanta. They're sending representatives." Wilson leaned forward slightly. "May I ask what charges he's facing?" "Potentially several federal offenses," the detective explained. "Carrying a firearm on a commercial aircraft is prohibited for everyone except federal air marshals and other specifically authorized personnel. Add to that making threats, public intoxication, interfering with flight crew. The FBI will be taking over the case." Wilson nodded, then asked, "Has Officer Reed made any calls? Does he have representation?" The question seemed to surprise them. "You're concerned about his legal rights?" Captain Brennan asked. I believe in due process, Wilson replied simply, regardless of his behavior today. The detective studied Wilson for a moment. He's been informed of his rights and offered a phone call. He's waiting for a union representative. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. An officer entered and handed Captain Brennan a tablet. "Ma'am, you might want to see this. It's already going viral." Brennan looked at the screen, then passed it to Wilson. It showed a social media post with video from the incident, already accumulating thousands of views and comments. The caption read, "Racist cop threatens Black Army general on flight today. Listen to what he says. Racism, police, military." Wilson handed the tablet back without commenting on the racial framing. Throughout his career, he'd focused on his work, rather than his identity, though he was well aware of how others sometimes viewed him through that lens first. "This will complicate things," he observed quietly. "It already has," Brennan confirmed. "We've got media arriving, and your name has been identified in several posts. I'm afraid your privacy is already compromised, General." Wilson accepted this, with the same calm he'd shown on the aircraft. "I understand. What happens next?" "We'll need a formal written statement from you. The FBI will want to interview you as well. After that, you're free to continue your journey, though we may need to contact you for further information as the case progresses." As they continued discussing logistics, Wilson's phone buzzed with incoming messages. His aide at the Pentagon had already been alerted to the situation and was arranging transportation to D.C. The Secretary of the Army had called twice. 3 news organizations had somehow obtained his number and were requesting interviews. What had begun as a personal confrontation was rapidly expanding into something much larger, a potential flashpoint in ongoing national conversations about authority, race, and accountability. Wilson had spent his career navigating complex geopolitical landscapes, but this unexpected domestic battlefield would require equally careful navigation. Outside the conference room, the story was spreading like wildfire across social media platforms. Clips from multiple passenger videos were being edited together, with various captions and commentary reflecting the divided perspectives of those sharing them. Some focused on Reed's language and behavior, others on Wilson's calm response, and still others on broader questions about how someone like Reed had been entrusted with a badge and gun in the first place. By the time Wilson completed his statement, 2 hours later, the incident had been reported by major news networks. His phone continued to buzz with notifications and calls from colleagues, friends, and increasingly, public figures seeking to associate themselves with him or the narrative emerging around the incident. As an escort led him toward a private exit, where transportation waited, Wilson passed a television in the airport terminal. It was tuned to a news channel where a panel was already discussing the incident, with his military photo displayed prominently alongside grainy images from the plane. The chyron at the bottom read, "Breaking, military leader faces down, armed. Police officer in mid-air confrontation." Wilson paused briefly, struck by the surreal experience of seeing himself transformed into a symbol before he'd even reached his destination. One of the commentators was saying, "This incident raises serious questions about screening procedures for law enforcement officers carrying weapons." The escort gently indicated they should continue moving. "This way, sir. We have a car waiting to take you to a hotel where you can have some privacy." As they walked, Wilson's phone rang again. This time it was his daughter. Undoubtedly having seen the news, he answered immediately. "Dad?" Her voice was tight with worry. "Are you okay? It's all over the news. They're saying, 'I'm fine,'" he assured her. "Everything you're hearing is probably exaggerated. I'll call you back in a few minutes when I have more privacy, okay? Give the baby a kiss for me." After hanging up, Wilson reflected on how quickly personal experiences now became public property, shaped and reshaped by countless hands into narratives that often bore little resemblance to the lived reality. He would need to be thoughtful about his next steps, what he said and didn't say, which platforms and forums he engaged with and which he avoided. As he settled into the back seat of the waiting car, Wilson gazed out at the gathering news vans with their satellite dishes and reporters preparing for live broadcasts. The day had begun with a simple flight home after visiting family. Now it had become something that would likely follow him for years to come, perhaps even define a portion of his legacy beyond his military service. The car pulled away from the terminal, and Wilson took a deep breath. The immediate crisis had passed, but he knew from experience that what followed such incidents, the investigations, the public discourse, the calls for reform, often proved more challenging than the incident itself. And unlike a military operation with clear objectives and chain of command, this would unfold in the messier arena of public opinion and institutional politics. Whatever came next, Wilson determined to approach it with the same values that had guided his military career: integrity, respect for proper procedure, and a commitment to addressing problems rather than simply managing their appearance. The car turned onto the highway, leaving the airport and its cluster of media behind, at least for now. Morning light filtered through the hotel room curtains as Lieutenant General Wilson reviewed his notes for the press statement he would deliver in 2 hours. He'd managed 4 hours of sleep before waking at his usual 5 a.m., his body still running on military time despite the extraordinary circumstances. His phone had not stopped buzzing since yesterday. Overnight, the video clips from the plane had been viewed millions of times. Morning news shows were leading with the story, and social media was ablaze with hashtags related to the incident. Wilson had instructed his aide to screen all calls, allowing through only those from his family, the Pentagon, and the investigating authorities. A knock at the door announced the arrival of breakfast, and Colonel Rivera, his chief of staff, who had flown in from Washington late last night to assist with managing the situation. "Morning, sir," Rivera said, setting down a folder of documents alongside the room service tray. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine, Luis," Wilson replied, pouring coffee for them both. "What's the latest?" Rivera opened the folder. "Officer Reed has been formally charged with multiple federal offenses. The Atlanta Police Department has placed him on administrative leave pending their own investigation. His police union initially issued a statement of support, but they've pulled it after more videos surfaced." Wilson nodded, absorbing the information. "And the passengers?" "Most continued to their destinations this morning. Several have given interviews to the press. The airline has issued a formal apology to you and all passengers affected. They're cooperating fully with the investigation." Wilson took a sip of coffee. "What about the broader response?" Rivera grimaced slightly. "It's become politically charged, as expected. Various groups are framing it according to their existing narratives. Some police organizations are distancing themselves from Reed, calling him one bad apple. Civil rights groups are citing the incident as evidence of systemic issues. Several members of Congress have made statements. And the Pentagon? The Secretary of Defense would like you to keep a low profile, but the Secretary of the Army believes you should address this directly. They're concerned about how it might affect military-police relations and public perception of both institutions." Wilson considered this. Throughout his career, he'd avoided becoming entangled in political debates, focusing instead on his duties, but this incident had thrust him into the spotlight, whether he wanted it or not. "What do you think, Luis?" he asked. Rivera, who had served alongside Wilson for 7 years, didn't hesitate. "I think you need to speak your truth, sir. People respect you because you've always been straight with them. This situation needs that kind of clarity." Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "Let's review the statement once more then." For the next hour, they refined the brief remarks Wilson would deliver at a press conference arranged by the Army's Public Affairs Office. It needed to be balanced, acknowledging the seriousness of what had occurred without inflaming tensions, addressing systemic issues without condemning all law enforcement, and most importantly, focusing on constructive paths forward. Meanwhile, across town at the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Headquarters, Officer James Reed sat in an interrogation room with his attorney and a representative from his police union. The initial bravado he'd displayed on the aircraft had crumbled in the face of the evidence against him, and the swift abandonment by many of his colleagues. "The blood test confirmed you were over the legal limit," his attorney was explaining. "Combined with the videos and witness statements, we're facing an uphill battle. The federal charges alone could mean years in prison." Reed stared at the table, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. What about my job? The union representative shifted uncomfortably. James, I need to be straight with you. Internal Affairs has already pulled your personnel file. There were 3 prior complaints of excessive force that were dismissed. 2 involved minority suspects. With this incident going viral, the department is under enormous pressure. They're going to fire me, Reed said flatly. They're going to conduct an investigation, the representative corrected, though his tone lacked conviction. But you should prepare for that possibility, yes. Reed's attorney leaned forward. Our best strategy is to show remorse, emphasize your service record, and possibly point to stress and mental health factors that contributed to the incident. You want me to apologize? To him? Reed's voice rose. I want you to avoid spending the next decade in federal prison, the attorney replied firmly. What happened on that plane was recorded from multiple angles. We can't dispute the facts. We can only try to provide context and show that you understand the severity of your actions. Reed rubbed his face with his hands. The past 24 hours felt like a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. His career, his reputation, his freedom, everything he'd built over 15 years in law enforcement was crumbling around him. And somewhere in the back of his mind, through the haze of self-pity and resentment, a small voice was beginning to whisper that perhaps he had indeed been wrong. Not just tactically, but fundamentally. Back at the hotel, Wilson had finished, dressing in his full military uniform. The 4 stars on his shoulders caught the light as he adjusted his tie. He'd decided to appear in uniform to represent not just himself, but the institution he served. This wasn't about him personally. It was about the values and principles that uniform represented. Car's ready, sir, Rivera informed him. The press is already gathering. Wilson nodded, taking a final moment to center himself. Throughout his career, he'd briefed presidents, testified before Congress, and addressed troops before combat operations. But this press conference felt different, more personal, yet simultaneously more significant in its potential impact on national conversations about power, respect, and accountability. The press conference was held in a ballroom at the hotel, now filled with reporters, cameras, and the buzz of anticipation. When Wilson entered, flanked by Rivera and 2 public affairs officers, the room fell silent, then erupted with shouted questions and camera flashes. The Army public affairs officer stepped to the microphone first. Ladies and gentlemen, Lieutenant General Thomas Wilson will make a brief statement regarding yesterday's incident. He will not be taking questions at this time, as this remains an active investigation. Wilson took his place at the podium, his posture straight but not rigid. His expression composed but not stern. He looked directly into the cameras as he began to speak. Good morning. Yesterday, while traveling as a civilian on a commercial flight, I was involved in an incident that has since received considerable public attention. I want to address this situation directly. What happened on that aircraft was unfortunate and unnecessary. An officer sworn to protect the public endangered that same public by bringing an unauthorized weapon onto a commercial flight and behaving in a manner inconsistent with his oath of service. I do not believe this incident should be used to condemn all law enforcement officers, the vast majority of whom serve with honor and distinction. Rather, it should prompt us to examine the systems that sometimes fail to identify and address concerning behavior before it escalates. Throughout my 30 years of military service, I have worked alongside dedicated police officers both domestically and internationally. The partnership between military and law enforcement is essential to our national security and public safety. That partnership must be built on mutual respect, shared values, and accountability. I have been asked why I remained calm during this confrontation. The answer is simple. That's what we are trained to do. Whether in the military or law enforcement, our job is to de-escalate situations, not inflame them. To protect, not endanger. To serve something larger than ourselves. In the coming days, I will cooperate fully with all investigations into this matter. I ask that we allow these processes to unfold properly, guided by facts rather than emotion or political agendas. I also ask that we use this moment not to deepen divisions but to recommit ourselves to the fundamental values that unite us as Americans: respect for human dignity, equal treatment under the law, and the peaceful resolution of conflicts. Thank you. As Wilson stepped away from the podium, the room erupted again with questions, but he maintained his composed expression as he exited. Outside the press room, Rivera handed him a phone. "The president would like to speak with you, sir." Wilson took the phone, stepping into a private room prepared for him. "Mr. President, this is Lieutenant General Wilson." "General," the president's voice came through clearly, "I've just watched your statement. Thank you for handling this situation with the dignity and leadership it requires. I'd like to discuss this with you further when you return to Washington." "Yes, sir. I'll make myself available at your convenience." After the call concluded, Wilson turned to Rivera. "What's next?" "The FBI would like another statement from you. Then we have a secure call with the Joint Chiefs scheduled for this afternoon. Your flight to D.C. is arranged for this evening." Wilson nodded, mentally preparing for the long day ahead. As they walked toward the waiting car, he caught sight of a television in the hotel lobby showing footage from the press conference. Below his image, the caption read, "Leadership under pressure. General's response to racial confrontation sparks national conversation." In that moment, Wilson understood that this incident had transcended the personal. It had become a lightning rod for broader discussions about race, authority, and accountability in American society. His response, both on the plane and in the days to come, would matter not just for his own career or for Officer Reed's fate, but for how these critical issues would be addressed in the public forum. As they drove to the FBI field office, Wilson's phone buzzed with a message from his daughter. "So proud of you, Dad. You showed them what real strength looks like." Wilson smiled slightly at the message. Throughout his career, he had faced enemy fire, navigated complex diplomatic situations, and made life-or-death decisions affecting thousands. But sometimes the most important battles were fought not on traditional battlefields but in ordinary spaces, like row 5 of a commercial aircraft, where principles were tested and character revealed in unexpected moments. The car turned into the FBI parking lot, where another group of reporters waited. The next phase of this unexpected journey was about to begin. 2 weeks had passed since the incident on Flight 237. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Lieutenant General Wilson's office at the Pentagon, casting long rectangles of light across his desk where a stack of reports awaited his attention. But Wilson's focus was on the television mounted on the wall, tuned to a news channel with the sound muted. On screen, the chief of the Atlanta Police Department stood at a podium, his expression solemn as he addressed a room full of reporters. The caption at the bottom of the screen read, "Atlanta PD announces termination of Officer James Reed following airplane incident." Wilson unmuted the television as Colonel Rivera entered with coffee. After a thorough investigation into the events of 2 weeks ago, the police chief was saying, and in accordance with department policies regarding conduct unbecoming an officer, unlawful possession of a firearm on an aircraft, and violation of our anti-discrimination policies, Officer James Reed has been terminated from the Atlanta Police Department, effective immediately. Wilson and Rivera watched in silence as the chief continued. "The behavior displayed by former Officer Reed does not reflect the values or standards of our department. We hold our officers to the highest level of professionalism, and we cannot tolerate actions that violate the public trust or the dignity of any individual based on their race, rank, or background." A reporter called out from the audience, "Chief, has the department reviewed Officer Reed's prior complaints?" The chief nodded gravely. "Yes. In light of this incident, we have reopened investigations into 3 previously dismissed complaints against former Officer Reed. We are also conducting a broader review of our internal affairs procedures to ensure that patterns of concerning behavior are properly identified and addressed before they escalate." Wilson turned to Rivera. "They're doing the right thing." "Because they have to," Rivera replied. "The videos left them no choice." Wilson shook his head. "It matters less why they're doing it than that they're doing it. Accountability is accountability." The press conference continued as reporters pressed for details about the department's plans for reform. Wilson muted the television again and turned his attention to his desk, where a different set of documents waited. Notes for his upcoming testimony before the House Committee on Armed Services and Law Enforcement Coordination. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Rivera asked. "As ready as I can be," Wilson replied. "Though I'd rather be focusing on our actual military operations than becoming the poster child for police reform." Rivera smiled slightly. "Sometimes we don't choose our battles, sir." "No," Wilson agreed, "but we do choose how we fight them." The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind. After his initial press statement, Wilson had returned to Washington to find himself at the center of a national conversation. The videos from the plane had been viewed hundreds of millions of times. News programs had dissected every moment of the confrontation. Political figures on all sides had attempted to frame the incident to support their existing positions on policing, race relations, and military authority. Through it all, Wilson had maintained his measured approach, refusing to be drawn into partisan battles or personal attacks. He'd met privately with police leadership organizations to discuss training and accountability. He'd spoken with civil rights groups about systemic challenges, and he'd briefed military leaders on the implications for service members who might face similar situations. Now he was being called to Capitol Hill to provide his perspective on how military training and de-escalation might inform police practices, and how the two institutions could better align their approaches to authority and public service. As Wilson reviewed his notes, his secure phone rang. The caller ID showed it was the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia. "General Wilson, this is David Chen, U.S. Attorney. I wanted to update you personally on the federal case against Mr. Reed." "I appreciate that, Mr. Chen. What can you tell me?" "We've reached a plea agreement. Reed will plead guilty to unlawfully possessing a firearm on an aircraft and making threats that interfered with the flight crew's duties. In exchange for his guilty plea and his agreement to undergo bias training, we're recommending a sentence of 2 years, with possibility of parole after 8 months. Wilson processed this information. "That seems lenient for the charges involved." "It is," Chen acknowledged, but his attorney made a compelling case about his previous service record, and Reed has agreed to make a public statement acknowledging his actions and apologizing specifically to you and the other passengers. "I see." Wilson paused. "And the civil rights violations? Those charges were harder to prove definitively in court despite what we all heard on the videos. Rather than risk losing that aspect at trial, we focused on the weapons charges, which are straightforward." Wilson had been in Washington long enough to understand the pragmatism behind such decisions, even if he didn't fully agree with them. "Thank you for the update, Mr. Chen." After hanging up, Wilson shared the news with Rivera, who shook his head in disbelief. 8 months for pointing a gun on an airplane? If the roles had been reversed? "I know," Wilson said quietly. "But focusing on that disparity won't help us move forward. The more important question is what happens next, not just with Reed, but with the systems that produced him." Later that afternoon, Wilson received an unexpected request. Reed's attorney had reached out through proper channels, asking if Wilson would be willing to meet with his client before tomorrow's congressional hearing. Reed wanted to apologize in person, away from cameras and reporters. Wilson's first instinct was to decline. He had no personal desire to see Reed again, and his schedule before the hearing was already packed. But after reflection, he agreed to a brief meeting at a secure location. The following morning, Wilson arrived at a small conference room in the Hart Senate office building 2 hours before his scheduled testimony. Reed was already there, seated, at the table with his attorney. Gone was the defiant, angry man from the airplane. In his place sat someone who looked smaller somehow, diminished by the consequences of his actions. Reed stood awkwardly as Wilson entered. His attorney nodded encouragingly. "General Wilson," Reed began, his voice rough. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Wilson nodded but said nothing, waiting. "I want to apologize for my behavior on that flight," Reed continued. "It was unprofessional, dangerous, and wrong. The things I said to you were inexcusable. There's no justification for any of it." Wilson studied the man before him. The apology seemed rehearsed but not entirely insincere. Reed was clearly struggling with his dramatic fall from respected officer to disgraced former cop facing prison time. "What do you want from this meeting, Mr. Reed?" Wilson asked directly. Reed looked surprised by the question. I don't know. I guess I wanted you to know that I'm not always the person you saw that day. That I've had time to think about what I did and said. And what have you concluded from that thinking?" Reed glanced at his attorney, who remained silent, then back to Wilson. "That I've been carrying around anger and biases that I didn't want to admit were there. That I abused the authority I was given. That I betrayed my oath." Wilson nodded slowly. "Recognition is the first step, but it's only valuable if it leads to change." "I'm going to prison," Reed said, a hint of his old bitterness creeping in. "My career is over. My reputation is destroyed. What else is there?" "There's the rest of your life," Wilson replied simply. "Prison terms end. New careers can be built, but only if you use this time to genuinely address the issues that brought you here. This isn't just about one bad day on an airplane. It's about the attitudes and behaviors that led to that day." Reed didn't respond immediately, seemingly absorbing Wilson's words. His attorney checked his watch and gestured that their time was nearly up. "I accept your apology, Mr. Reed," Wilson said finally. "Not just for myself, but for the other passengers you frightened, the department you dishonored, and the public whose trust you violated. What matters now is what you do next." As Wilson stood to leave, Reed asked, "Will you be talking about me at the hearing today?" "Not specifically," Wilson answered. "Today isn't about you or me as individuals. It's about the larger issues your actions brought to light, how we select, train, and hold accountable those we entrust with authority, whether they wear a police uniform or military insignia." An hour later, Wilson sat before the congressional committee, cameras broadcasting his testimony nationwide. The hearing room was packed with lawmakers, media, police representatives, military officials, and civil rights advocates. The chairman welcomed him and invited his opening statement. Wilson looked down at his prepared remarks, then set them aside. After 2 weeks of carefully scripted statements and talking points, he decided to speak from his heart and experience. "Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the committee, the incident that brings me before you today lasted less than 15 minutes on an airplane, but it has sparked discussions that are long overdue in our society about power, respect, bias, and accountability. As a military officer, I've spent my career in an institution that is far from perfect, but that strives continuously to improve. We've learned, sometimes painfully, that maintaining discipline requires more than punishing infractions. It requires creating a culture where the right behaviors are valued, where character matters as much as competence, and where leadership means modeling the standards we expect others to uphold. The confrontation I experienced was not simply between two individuals. It was between two different approaches to authority. One views authority as power over others. The other sees it as responsibility to others. One demands respect. The other earns it through actions. In both our military and law enforcement communities, we must be united in understanding that the authority we're granted is a sacred trust, not a personal privilege. It comes with obligations that must be met every day, in every interaction. I don't claim to have all the answers, but I do know that meaningful change requires honest self-examination, courage to address uncomfortable truths, and commitment to holding ourselves and our institutions accountable. The question before us is not just how to prevent another incident like the one I experienced. It's how to build systems where such incidents become unthinkable, because they run counter to the core values and daily practices of those entrusted with public safety and national security. I look forward to your questions and to being part of this important conversation. Thank you. As Wilson concluded, the room was silent for a moment before the chairman thanked him. The cameras continued to broadcast his image to millions of viewers across the country, not as a victim or hero of a viral incident, but as a leader helping to chart a path forward. Outside the hearing room, ordinary citizens watched on their phones and television screens. In Atlanta, police academy instructors paused their training to listen to his words. In military bases across the country, Service members gathered in break rooms to hear their fellow officer, and in a temporary holding facility, awaiting transfer to federal prison, James Reed watched silently on a small television, confronting the consequences of choices that had brought him to this point. The incident on Flight 237 had lasted less than 15 minutes, but its ripples would continue to spread, challenging institutions, changing policies, and perhaps in small but meaningful ways, helping to bridge divides in a nation still struggling to live up to its highest ideals. As the hearing continued, into the afternoon, Wilson answered questions thoughtfully, neither minimizing problems nor exaggerating solutions. He spoke as he had led throughout his career, with integrity, clarity, and a deep commitment to service beyond self. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same steady resolve that had guided him through that unexpected confrontation 30,000 feet above the ground, where principles and character had been tested in ways no one could have anticipated.